We're in Penine Halacha, a section called Zmanim, the book called Zmanim, with the section, chapter 6, called the Four Fast commemorating the section of the temple. Those who are in my fundamentals class, we read from the Psukim inside. And on page 118,
is that correct?
it's fine.
Because that contains that.
It's fine. Chapter 118.
Guys.
We're starting. On page 118, there's a quote from the Talmud. The Talmud describes the following question. That after the destruction of the first temple, the Jewish people went into exile, and that's what we commemorated. We talked about it, but we know that throughout the years of the exile, of course, they were fasting these days. And when they were privileged to build the second temple, the question arose: must we continue to fast? You're in Jerusalem. You're rebuilding the second temple. So the prophet Zechariah was asked this question in chapter 8, verse 19, page 118. Who can read for me? One second.
Tell me the first word.
Thus said
the Lord of hosts, the fast of the 4th month in Tammuz, the fast of the 5th month, ninth Av, the fast of the 7th month, Sion Gedalia, and the fast of the 10th month, 10th of Tevet, shall become occasions for joy and gladness, happy festivals for the house of Judah. But you must love honesty and integrity. Zechariah 8:19.
Indeed, during the Second Temple era, these days became joyous festivals. Why fast if the temple's rebuilt? However, we know when the Second Temple was destroyed, the original enactment was reinstated for all 4 fast days. However, the date of the fast in Tammuz, commemorating the breach of Jerusalem's walls, was changed. The first temple was destroyed. Everybody see where I'm reading? Page 118. The city breached on the 9th of Tammuz, not the 17th. We saw that psukim in the morning. Those who were with me. Thus, the Jewish people fasted on that day throughout the 70-year Babylonian exile. When the second temple was destroyed, however, Jerusalem was breached on the 17th of Tammuz, which is when we have fasted ever since. Even though the 4 fasts were originally instituted by the prophets to commemorate the destruction of the first temple, which is why we fast on the 10th of Tevet, which is when Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem during the time of the first temple, and on Tzom Gedalia, which marks the end of the Jewish sovereignty in Eretz Yisrael at the end of the first temple era. The sages nonetheless decided to establish the fast commemorating the breach of Jerusalem on the 17th of Tammuz, which is when the city was breached at the time of the second temple, because the pain of the second destruction is more acute to us. Furthermore, the verse calls that fast the fast of the 4th month, implying that the most important part of the enactment is that it should take place sometime during the 4th month, Tammuz. Therefore, even when the sages changed the date from the 9th to the 17th, they did not substantively alter the prophet's enactment of a fast in the 4th month over the breach of Jerusalem. Nothing has changed with regard to the 9th of Av, because both temples were destroyed on that day. So this is a little bit of a halachic discussion. We have to recognize, when we fast today, is it a rabbinic institution? Which would mean that it was instituted by the rabbis. What rabbis? When we say the rabbis, usually we refer to the sages. When did they live? Which sages? Post Second Temple, the Tanaim, the Amoraim, post Second Temple. So they instituted many mitzvot. Many mitzvot were rabbinic mitzvot. However, what we're doing here, what this whole passage, this introductory passage was setting the groundwork for saying, when we fast these 4 fasts, we're actually not merely keeping a rabbinic mitzvah. This harks back to the end of the first temple period. 500 years before the sages. And this was the practice of the Jews exiled to Babylonia. In the 70 years of exile, they were fasting these 4 fast days. So when we're reinstituting the fasts, they stopped, and they came back during the second temple period. And after the second temple, when they reinstated them, So essentially, we're continuing on the tradition which was way back. This is there's another category halachically. We know there's biblical mitzvah and a rabbinic mitzvah. This is a rabbinic mitzvah which is in a pasuk. Sometimes it gets the moniker divrei Kabbalah, not the mystical Kabbalah. Kabbalah meaning tradition, a tradition which is written in the Bible. It's a rabbinic institution which is written in the Bible. It's a sort of a unique sort of halfway between the Rabbanan and the Oraita. So it's a very strong ancient custom. This was what he was doing by laying the groundwork. Now I'll take a question, Renan. Thank you for waiting.
Yeah, just like English stuff. Why do you think commemorate? It's like it's not
From the word memory,
okay.
commemorate.
It seems like celebrating.
Yeah, so it's not quite celebrating, it's just marking in our memory. Yeah,
Okay.
that's the word. Hershey, do you want to say?
Yeah, so Yom Kippur is a Tanakhic fast and like the other
Biblical,
fasts.
100%, right. The only one that's biblical is Kippur. Yes, sorry.
I heard that, I don't know if this is Yom Kippur or Ninth of Av or maybe Tishrei, but in the future it'll be like an actual holiday. Like, there'll be a day of.
So we just read the verses in Zechariah, said all four will be holidays.
Okay.
All four of these, when the temple's rebuilt, we won't fast, we'll party. Yes.
I've wondered why
Reference to memory.
10th of Tevet is the beginning of the siege, whereas in the case of 17th of Tammuz is when the Romans actually breached the walls, not when they began the siege.
Correct.
Is that because the Babylonian siege began the three occupations, whereas with the Roman one it was the final straw? Or what's the reason for that?
If we just focus on the first temple period, it's a process. This is the beginning of the process. Continued to the breaching of the walls after the siege, and then the destruction of the temple. So it's 3 stages. And
But
then
right, but why
the
do you
final
pick-
stage of Tzom Gedalia, when Gedalia was killed, the leader after the destruction. So if we focus on the first temple, it makes clear that there's 4 times this process is so significant to the Jewish people that we mark all the 4 stages of its destruction.
But that's my question, is why for one holiday it's the beginning of the siege, whereas for another, the date that we choose to mark. Whereas for the 17th of Tammuz, that what we choose to mark is the falling of the walls, not the beginning of the siege.
It's the same siege. Siege means when the armies
No, one's Babylonians, one's Roman.
No, also in the first temple, Babylonian siege resulted in the walls being breached after a year and a half. Starts on the 10th of Tevet. They laid the siege, and it was successful after a year and a half on the 9th of Tammuz, which became the 17th of Tammuz, but it was the 9th of Tammuz, a year and a half later, the same siege. But you know what? That's the result of a siege, is that you break through the walls, right? You don't just wait around side. Okay, other questions? Good. Okay, let's move ahead to section 2, called Asara B'Tevet. I will point out that at the bottom of page 119, in the footnote, there is another opinion that according to the Rishalmi, Rabbi Tamchon ben Chanilai said, if you see about halfway down through the footnote, it says, in truth, Jerusalem was breached on the 17th of Tammuz during the first temple period as well, even though the verses we said saw that it was on the 9th. People miscalculated, thinking that the breach had occurred on the 9th, and the verse did not want to deviate from what people thought. However, there's a debate in the Talmud. Rava said that it actually was on the 9th, while in the second temple it was the 17th, and that's what it seems to be a machlok between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi about exactly what date it happened on, the destruction of the breach of the walls in the first temple period.
What did Yerushalmi say? Says that it's a mistake, or says the 9th?
It's a mistake. Yeah, it's a mistake. Rava said it was on the 9th. Anyways, let's move ahead. Asara B'Tevet. Tomorrow is the fast. Let's see why. The prophets established a fast on the fast day on the 10th of Tevet, because that is when Nebuchadnezzar's army arrived to besiege Jerusalem, marking the beginning of the series of catastrophes which culminated in the destruction of the first temple and the exile of the divine presence. siege that led to the destruction of the Second Temple began on a different date. Nevertheless, the beginning of the overall destruction of the Temple and the Jewish kingdom occurred on the 10th of Tevet. So we're more commemorating the first temple on this fast day than on the others, right? There's an equivalent in Tisha B'Av, there's an equivalent in Tammuz, but there was no equivalent of the 10th of Tevet in the Second Temple era. We go back to the originals, the really beginning of the destruction. Turn the page to page 120. Once the Sabbath table is established as a fast day, the sages added two other painful events which occurred around that date to the day's commemoration: the death of Ezra, the scribe, which occurred on the 9th of Tevet. That's today, in the translation of the Torah into Greek, which occurred on the 8th of Tevet. And additionally, there's one more element. The chief rabbinate of Israel further established it as a day of general mourning and recitation of Kaddish for the martyrs who were killed in the Holocaust and whose date of death is unknown. So we have, the Talmud actually says, we should be fasting for 3 days in a row: the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th of Tevet. Phew, luckily, we don't. But we still remember, and we have to talk about why they would want to establish a fast day for those other events. We spoke about the siege of Jerusalem being the beginning of the end, but what about the others?
Wasn't Yusuf also sold around this time period?
There may be a midrash to that effect, but it doesn't say in the pasuk what time it was. But yes, Malti.
As far as I heard, you're not allowed to fast more than 1 day.
It's not that we're not allowed to; it's just the sages thought it was unwise. Some people that fast a few days. It's not healthy.
Unwise, but still allowed.
Yeah. I don't know of any Isser to
I
fast.
understand this is not allowed.
No, I don't know of anything that says you're not allowed to fast 2 days. Okay, so what are the other two events? Death of Ezra and translation of the Torah into Greek. So let's talk about the first one first.
The translation is a bad thing?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Let's talk about that. You have to understand why. But it's such a bad thing that they wanted to establish a fast on the day that the Torah was translated to Greek. We're going to discuss it, yeah.
So this translation of the Torah to Greek, does it still exist? Is there some group, like a Christian group that they still use that translation or whatever? Like, do we know the exact Greek words that they have?
So there is something called the Septuagint,
Mm-hmm.
which is called that because septa is 70. So it's definitely patterned after this concept that we're going to read about it, that they took the Greek king declared that 70 of the elders should be holed up and tasked them with translating the Torah into Greek, and that's why it's called
the miracle, and then they all translated the exact same way. Yeah, but does this translation still exist?
So we don't know that the Septuagint that we have is exactly the same one that they have, not necessarily. We don't know.
Wouldn't it? I thought that the Christians used versions of everything that was translated from Greek in terms of their testament, and that would, I assume, would also be our version.
So
the so-called King James and
history's
everything.
had a lot of there's a lot of texts and a lot of translations, and it's hard for us to know exactly which one is which. We do have a few records in the Talmud about the different changes which the rabbis made. We're going to get to that in just a minute, but they don't all appear that same way in the Septuagint. So that's why I'm hesitant to say well, the text that we have, which is called the Septuagint, is not the original one which we commemorate yesterday, which we commemorated yesterday, or should have commemorated yesterday. But let's start first with Ezra the scribe. We'll follow the text. Okay, page 120. Who can read for me? The sages say. Who can read? Someone wants to volunteer and read? Ezra, go for it.
The sages say that Ezra the scribe was worthy.
Just read slowly, please, because I'm a slow reader and a slow listener.
The sages say that Ezra the scribe was worthy of having the Torah given through him, had Moshe not preceded him. Sanhedrin 21b. He is second in stature only to Moshe. Ezra enacted 10 fundamental decrees, Melachama 22:8, and by doing so laid the foundation for the activities of the sages of the oral Torah, who likewise made enactments instituted safeguards for the Torah. The sages further state that Ezra, who migrated from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael to build a second temple, was actually the prophet Menachem in Gil 59. This is, on one hand, he was the last of the prophets of those who belongs to the era of the written Torah, while on the other hand, he was the first sage of the oral Torah. Thus, he was the great Torah scholar who linked the written Torah and oral Torah. And just like Moshe, he cared for the people of Israel and bore the burden of leading them. He was one of the leaders of the return to Eretz Yisrael from Babylonia and one of the builders of the Second Temple.
Wait, what's your name?
And he's second only to me.
You choose purple. Purple.
What?
Says right
Ezra is second only to
here.
Moshe.
You're to Moshe. You're second only to me.
So we did mention this a little bit when we were talking about Hanukkah, right? We were talking about Hanukkah and saying that we're celebrating the Torah of the Second Temple era and the Hasmoneans, which led into the sages, and the light of the menorah represents the light of the Torah, the content, this Jewish culture which developed in contradistinction to the Hellenistic culture. And we mentioned that it starts because Ezra was the start, the foundation of this oral Torah, of this restatement of Judaism in the Second Temple period. Ezra was greatest, second only to Moshe in his stature. He's known as Ezra the scribe. And very well stated here, he was sort of on the border between the written Torah because he was responsible for, they say, canonizing the Tanakh, Torah Nevim Ketuvim, deciding what goes in, what goes out. Even the Talmud records that he worked on the manuscripts to try to get the best version of whenever there was variant. Apparently there were variant readings in some places in the Torah. And some people explain that that's why there's dots on top of some letters in the Torah. Did you know in some letters in the Torah, some words have some dots on them? Some people say that was added by Ezra the scribe whenever there was a discrepancy between the different variants and he didn't want to decide, or he wanted to let you know at least that he was deciding between different variants. That's one interpretation about why those dots are there. There's other interpretations too. But Ezra is a very central figure in, first of all, getting the written Torah, formalized, and that's why he's called Ezra the scribe. But no less than that, he's also known as the leader of a link in the chain of the oral Torah, right? Being a member of the Knesset Hagdolah. Some people say he actually was the same person as Malachi. Malachi, famously, chronologically, the last of the prophets that have a book in the Bible. The last of the prophets mentioned chronologically is Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Malachi, some people say that was Ezra, so he was, as we know that there were Nevi'im, there were a few prophets as members of the Men of Great Assembly, that assembly during that period, that was the leadership of the Jewish people. Ezra, if he was Malachi, perhaps he was the last one that's considered to be still a prophet. And they, as we learned on Hanukkah, the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the Men of the Great Assembly, they established many things for us, many of the rabbinic mitzvot that we spoke about. Netilat Yadayim, candle lighting for Shabbos, and the Eruvin, all those, the list of Shvikas D'Oraita. It's a pasuk in the Torah. But the rabbinic mitzvot were established. It says brachot and shiurim, the measurements, how much matzah you have to eat on Pesach, how big a lulav can be, how short it can be, what the measurements of a mikvah are. All those were set down, established by the men of the Great Assembly, led by none other than Ezra Sofer. So Ezra, on the one hand, is the closing of the biblical era and the opening of the era of the rabbis, if you will, the era of the Second Temple period. Yeah.
I don't understand something, because I'm seeing here where we're saying that he's the last of the prophets, and yet I know that there were prophets in the Second Temple because we were reading in the Haftarah a few weeks ago where they were being rebuked for the carelessness that they went about certain things in that period of the Second Temple. So surely there were prophets after this. I don't understand I'm missing something.
I'm missing something from your question. It's that he was a prophet during the Second Temple period, so he was one of them.
But you're saying that he was the last one, I thought.
If he was Malachi, so then he's the last one that's brought. You're right. We read from the Haftarah from Malachi. He was the younger people. Right? The end of the prophecy is Zichru Torah Moshe Avdi. Remember the Torah of Moshe, my servant.
During the time period, outside of the Greeks, there were no prophecy at that time?
Correct.
So these were the sages that decided, Malachi, Zechariah, Haggai, all that they should destroy the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah. And Hashem's like, with it, I'm gonna take prophecy. And they're like, okay.
It's a beautiful midrash that you are using. Not sure everybody's familiar with it, so I'm not going to talk about it now. But that sounds like that was a description of exactly that transitional period between prophecy to an era where we don't have prophecy, and the rabbis were trying to give it some sense, make it fit in with a change in society, a change in our consciousness. But we're not learning that midrash right now, so I'll leave that. It's the same period.
So the siege under the Neo-Babylonian administration of Nebuchadnezzar was in 597 BCE, right? And when he first sieged the city but breached it, the first thing.
Does it say that? Where did you get that number from? I know the temple was destroyed in 586, right? Minus 586. How many years before that?
I don't know from the book.
The final siege was about a year and a half before that. So a year and a half before that would take us to minus 588. Okay? Now, it's true that I think 11 years before that, there was a previous siege. We read about it this morning. You missed it. Where Yehoiachin was taken and exiled together with all the gold and the silver. But it sounds like, and it says there that the Nebuchadnezzar made a siege around Jerusalem, but it quickly says that they were exiled and they lost, but then the descendant of Yehoiachin, who became king after him, he rebelled again, and that's why Nebuchadnezzar had to come back on the 10th of Tevet and start his next and final siege of Jerusalem.
So this would be 588 BC.
Probably, yeah. The Sarah B'Tevet, 588. Okay, other questions? Let's move on. That's Ezra. So today is the day, the Yortzeit of Ezra, his memory be blessing. And that's commemorating, if you will, the destruction.
Where's he buried?
We don't know. We don't know where Ezra's buried.
Like Moshe.
Could be. I think there is a grave, a building and a grave site somewhere. Maybe near Bet Shemesh. I can't remember exactly where.
I know a lot of these.
But a lot of these are made up. They're not real. Yeah.
I know there's a discussion about whether King David's tomb is really his.
It's pretty sure it's not.
It's
Yeah.
attributing towards him as a sign of respect.
Oh, yeah,
It's
sure.
important to our traditions. and
For sure.
9% it's not.
Correct. Okay. Other questions? Someone else? Can we move on? So that's we're commemorating.
So that's Ezra.
Commemorating, of course, the 10th of Tevet, first temple. Then we moved on now to, after the return, the beginning of the second temple. Ezra starts us off, but then when he died, we want to commemorate that. And now we move on to later on. Who's going to read this section for me?
Later on during the Hellenistic.
Yeah, who's going to read that for me? Ezra, you read your section about Ezra.
Volunteer
You can't read about the
Ariel.
Hellenistic. Who wants to be the Hellenist? No.
I volunteer Ariel.
I think David should read. David, your brother's a translator, I know, of some words. So maybe you'll do the translations. Later on.
Translation.
Page 120, later on.
Okay. Later on, during the Hellenistic period, a terrible decree was issued against the Jewish people. They must translate the Torah into Greek. That day was calamitous.
It's fine. Yeah.
Calamitous for Israel as the day when the golden calf was made, because the Torah belongs to the Jewish people, and its translation into Greek undermined its uniqueness, allowing it to be viewed as something that anyone can handle. This occurred on the 8th of Tevet, causing darkness to descend upon the world for 3 days. Therefore, on Asar Tevet, we mention this painful event as well. My teacher and master Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook said that when we must rectify these 3 things on Asar Tevet, first, in response to the siege of Jerusalem, we must strengthen the walls of the city and build up Eretz Israel both spiritually and physically. Second, in response to the death of Ezra the scribe, we must enhance and glorify the Torah while working to bring about the ingathering of the exiles, as Ezra did. And third, in response to the translation of the Torah into Greek, we must restore the authentic spirit and culture of Israel and uproot all the spirits of wickedness that occurred to it throughout the duration of the exile when other nations ruled over us.
So, I'll go back to Renan's question.
That'll do.
Translation of the Torah is a bad thing? Good question. We are speaking English.
Yeah.
If we didn't have English, we're reading a book in English of Torah words translated to English. So why should we have to fast? Because the Torah is translated.
So,
Answers, ideas,
I do.
comments.
I have an
Moshe, you start us off.
So we've got Hebrew, Lashon Kodesh, then we have like all the other languages, English, Yiddish, Russian, and all the languages that the Torah has commonly been translated to. And then right at the bottom we have Greek, which is like the anti-Hebrew. Greek is so, because of what the Greeks did to us, Greek is such a horrible language that it's like the anti-Lashon Kodesh.
I hear you. That's a nice theory. Could be definitely seen that way. We definitely celebrated Hanukkah where we're celebrating the fight against the Hellenistic culture, and Greek can represent that. However, if you remember, on Hanukkah we also mentioned there's a special law that the Torah can be written, Sefer Torah can be written in every language. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said it can be written in only Greek, as opposed to, in addition to Hebrew, and therefore that shows us a little bit that Greek has a higher status than all the other languages, not a lower status than all the other languages, has a special status. And we talked about that on Hanukkah, how there were different stages of perhaps there being some kind of cross-pollination between Greek culture and Jewish culture, which is possible, but of course it's soured with the persecution of the Jewish people and the religious persecution, which we celebrated, shaking that yoke off of us on Hanukkah. But it's not a bad thought. Definitely Greek can be seen as the, defiling the Torah, as this first, attempt at making it something, undermining its uniqueness, as it says. It's a good start, Moshe. We're going to go around the room. Thomas next.
Could we get, as a senior of respect, the translated Torah on another Torah?
Say again?
Greek. Could be that as a senior of respect, they translated the Torah in Greek on another Torah?
It could be seen as a sign of respect. When you take the Torah and you take the trouble, it says, wow, the Torah is so valuable. It's a valuable cultural artifact. That's what the Greek philosophers were saying. We should translate it into our language so that we can have access to the wisdom. So that really just doesn't answer the question. It makes the question stronger. Why is that a bad thing? They wanted to learn from the Torah by translating it. What's wrong? Yes, Ariel.
Maybe once it's translated, then other nations can misinterpret it and use it in a way where it's around.
Could be that it definitely opens it up to misuse or abuse. Yes, or not?
Translation in general, it's like we lost things in a way. Because there is words that cannot be translated, and there is words that there is a deep meaning, there's things that cannot be understand or interpret in the other language. So
Correct.
It's one fact. The other thing is like they put missing understanding, and also they don't have the oral Torah to understand the deep meaning.
Very good.
So this could be many problems.
Very good. That's right. If you were just to read the written Torah without the oral Torah, you come up with some really strange ideas about what Judaism thinks and believes. And, our oral Torah enables us to take this, you could call it a dated document to the first millennium before, 1,000 years, 3,500 years old, with many of the cultural associations of the time. And if you take that and just do a fundamentalist reading of the text and try to apply that to the modern world, I believe you'd be doing a disservice to Judaism. That's not what Judaism thinks you should do. We have an oral Torah which applies the principles from the written Torah in every generation the way it should be applied. And so I think you're on the right track there. That sure, translating the Torah at just the written text without the traditional interpretation is doing a tremendous disservice. Malti, go ahead. No? Okay. Yes, Ezra.
So, a little bit what Ariel said, it says that the Torah was supposed to be for the Jews only and everything, and the Greeks wanted to learn the Jewish stuff as well. It's not that it's a problem that it's being translated into Greek, the problem is that it's just that it's going to be now known to everyone what the Torah is. So it loses its special kodesh for having only the Jews know, instead of having the whole entire world know.
Right. It's nice to have the feeling that we have a secret, right? You want to keep the secret. But makes me think, really, do we not want the rest of the world to know about, our beliefs, our practices?
I mean,
It's true, it's a closed club. We have rules, which are for the Jews, and God gave us these rules, and they're very holy, very special. And so, keep it a secret. I hear that. And if you translate it, you're breaking the secret. You're not wrong. I'm just wondering how then will we ever teach the rest of the world? I guess the assumption is we'll keep it for ourselves, and they'll just learn from seeing us from the outside. It's not that they're going to be they're studying our Torah together with us. It's something that's only for us. It's unique for us. One second. One at a time. We're just trying to let everybody talk. We only have a few minutes left. It's sort of like my wife is the most beautiful woman in the world. And I would love to share beautiful things with the rest of the world, but she's my wife. Right? You don't just because something's beautiful doesn't mean automatically you go ahead and share it. There's intimacy that would destroy the relationship. That's not the proper thing. Just because we have something good doesn't mean we have to spread it to everybody. It dilutes it. It could ruin it. So I'm just trying to understand, taking Ezra's theme and going a little further, trying to understand why there should be some kind of a secret. Why Torah should remain something only for the Jewish people, and therefore translating it might be doing it a disservice. It might be being a sign of being unfaithful to the Torah. Our relationship to Torah is like a marriage. You've heard that before, that metaphor. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to. So having the Torah being translated is almost like someone taking your wife and violating her. That's right? It's like taking her and sort of abusing her, forcing her to be out in the public where she doesn't want to be, the Torah wants to be. If you imagine the Torah like a love letter between God and the Jewish people. So do you really want your love letters posted on the internet? Some people do. I know, but that seems inappropriate to me. A lot of people do, but the concept of intimacy is I think being breached. You're on the right track there, Ezra, as well. Okay, I'll get a few other people who wanted to speak. Asher, I'm just trying to get everybody. Yeah.
Yes, sir. So here it talks about translation into Greek, but I understand that Aramaic is also some language is important. But why, if we are stretching the importance of a love letter with the first language of the world, which is Hebrew, then why use Aramaic?
Right. So we haven't really answered that. Why are we studying now in English? Why are the books we using in English? You could say that, once it was translated, that wall has been breached. Maybe it's similar to like the Shiva Serva Tammuz, the walls being breached. So then we have to deal with that situation, and that is that, we're just coming to terms with reality is that a lot of the Jews didn't know Hebrew and they needed a translation. And just like today, if we weren't allowed to study Torah in English, we wouldn't be able to be here in Machon Meir in the English department. No, none of us would be able to study Torah if we don't know Hebrew well enough.
All
So,
printed copies, even the ones printed in English, they all have Hebrew next to it.
So not all of them do, but that's part of the idea, is to remember to ourselves that even though we have a translation, we're using it as a crutch. Don't think that that's the ideal, that you should always walk with crutches, right? You want to learn slowly at the same time you're learning Hebrew. There's an Ulpan class, and your Hebrew will get so good, so that in the end you won't need the translation. It's a good point. I just want to take, someone else here wanted to speak, yeah.
I wanted to tie together a couple of things that were said. First of all, I was noticing in terms of Moshe was saying, two people were saying about the Greek Empire. Were they good? Were they bad? And it's interesting. I was thinking in the prayers we talk about when the wicked Greek kingdom rose up against your people Israel. So perhaps there was the good Greeks and there were the bad Greeks, and somewhere in between there it changed.
Absolutely. We spoke about that.
And then,
for sure.
Yeah, and then I think it's sign of respect. I think was brought up, but maybe it was a bit about today we talk about the objectification of women, that certain women will have pictures taken. They're being turned into objects. They're no longer.
So you don't want the Torah to be objectified
correct.
either. Yeah, lovely.
Therefore, ordering us to translate it, I'd say is more akin to rape. That it was forcibly taken rather than willfully given, even though it's the same objective may be being achieved, how it's occurring, and then practically speaking, how many cultures do we know that have been stripped of their perceived valuable bits? And then that's the first step, and then you assimilate them. So you come on, well, it's a beautiful holiday, we should all do that, and then we all do that, but then poof, there's no purpose to having that culture anymore. We need to assimilate them into modern American.
There's a danger to use.
It's a first. No, I'm saying it's the first step of assimilation, is absorbing those bits and pieces. It also makes the culture that's doing the assimilation seem more palatable to those. In other words, it's making it easier to assimilate Jews to Greek once the Torah is even in Greek.
100%. Yeah, definitely. There's that danger of assimilation. I hear that's another reason why you could look upon the translation of the Torah into Greek as something that we should fast for, and really it's a step away from our ideal where we're speaking our own language and our own culture, and a language is the carrier of culture, and it's only a stopgap measure that we're agreeing to teach Torah in English. I hope you guys think it's okay.
If we found a Torah in Greek today, would we burn it?
No. Nowadays, there's no reason to burn it. Okay, we have to stop here because there's another class coming. So by all means, I'll be here after class if you want to ask me a private question. But I want to make sure to be fair to the next teacher. And we'll stop here. And we will have a class tomorrow. And we can continue talking a little bit about the fast of the 10th of Tevet. And there's a discussion about exactly what we were saying right here. Thank you for Hirsch. He brought in this book, Torah Teretz Yisrael, the teaching of Tzvi Cohen Cook, and the approbation, the first letter Hirsch showed me by Avram Shapira, the former chief rabbi of Israel. He mentions and discusses this issue about translations, a good thing, a bad thing, and in the end of the day, of course, he says if the point is to teach Jews Torah, then it's allowed and even a mitzvah. We'll stop here. Have a good one.